Chapter 3. Time crept by in the silent house. I was alone most of the day, as Edward left early every morning to visit the palace for his lessons with Richard. Father was always busy with his trading business and was also away often. Our manor house buried my spirits in gloom, full of memories and forgotten laughter. Being underage, I was not yet allowed to come and go as I pleased in society, and I wasn't entitled to invite ladies to visit me either. The only company I had were the servants, and although their banter in the kitchen and hallways was refreshing, it was hardly fit for me to lower myself so and associate with them. I also often felt my presence was a nuisance to them. I ended up getting underfoot and making their work more difficult. Furthermore, Father refused to let me return to school, saying he had wasted enough money on me and wouldn't spend another shilling if he could help it. So I watched as the trees turned green and flowers pushed forth their buds. I spent most of my days outdoors. Every morning I sat in the library for an hour or two, fine-combing our modest collection for anything on magic. I found a few volumes that proved to be useful, including a lovely edition on collected fairy tales. I took flowers from the garden to Mother's grave almost every day, and then often ended up taking a walk over the fields and through the orchards around the house. Sometimes I'd even go into the labyrinth, but there it was hardest to hold the memories of my childhood at bay. Overall, those days of peaceful walks alone were filled with joy for me. At first, I used the time to think of all the things Mother had told me and to recall in infinite detail the incident when I had fallen into the pool of water. I did not drown, even though I hadn't known how to swim then. I couldn't recall a moment of discomfort from the inability to breathe. I couldn't even remember being afraid after the initial shock of falling in had subsided. As I reflected on the event, the knowledge of where the magic lay dawned on me. In time, I found its essence. From then onwards, I could sense that power within me as it surged and waned according to my mood. From there, it was merely a matter of time to remember the right stories which taught the core concept of control and how to perform magic. The materials I found in the library helped to complement what my mother had indeed taught me in secret. My skills improved, and I needed to keep my activities secret. I took to riding in the countryside to get further away from people, so I could practice in peace. I mostly went into the King's Forest, which stretched along the foothills of the Field Mountains from the palace gardens to the borders of our property. I knew very few people would ever go in there, as commoners trespassing was punished. With the space to practice, it did not take long for the ability to mold my will into reality to become easier and easier. I could light and put out a twig with greater speed every day. After a few short weeks, I heard a rabbit for the first time. My joy became talking to all the little creatures and learning of their happiness and woes. I learned to listen to the essence of living things, thus finding that all creatures have uses, existing to maintain the balance of the world. The plants taught me about healing and what to use in different situations, as well as how not to hurt them when gathering the parts I needed. One day I considered the belt Mother had given me. The nature of the protection and how it worked came to me. I was able to reproduce the protection, adapting it to different creatures for practice. I also learned to make protective barriers for physical attacks. Eventually, I was even able to stop the rain from falling on me. Nuriana, my dun horse, was pleased with that ability, as we were often caught in the rain while out in the woods behind the house. My regular rides in the King's Forest also taught me something else. I often came across snares set out for rabbits and other small game. There were people who were willing to face the consequences of poaching. Could things really be that desperate? My musings on the plight of some poor people brought me back to Mother's charitable nature. I had always loved how people revered and adored her. Everyone had always said Mother was the kindest noble in the entire kingdom. It had been so upsetting when none of them were allowed into the church to pay their last respects at her funeral. I wanted to be like that too. I wanted to be able to help. Time passed, and the bright green of spring turned darker, the sun's rays warmed more deeply, and the gentle rain stopped, replaced by shorter, heavy showers. The freedom I had to wander about our lands continued. Father and Edward were not the least bit interested in how I spent my days. They were so busy with their own endeavours I hardly saw them. They were not often home for dinner, and I preferred it that way. Father was always angry with me for any reason he could come up with, so I was happy not seeing him for days at a time. The staff also seemed relieved not to have to entertain me. One day on my roamings, Neriana slipped on a loose stone and I tumbled to the ground, knocking my hip hard. I was relieved I only had bruised flesh to show for it. However, Neriana's panic screech, her intense thoughts of terror and pain, informed me of her broken leg. The agony she felt filled me through the link we had forged over the previous weeks. Instinctively, I placed my hands over the lower leg, which had swelled to double the size. Using my newfound magical power, I could sense the bones, nerves, and all the other damaged parts beneath the skin. Luckily for Neriana, the bone had snapped and not shattered. I doubt I would have been able to heal her leg if it had required puzzling together smashed bits of bone. Somehow I just knew how to knit the broken limb, nerves, and blood vessels back together again. It was strangely straightforward to do. When I sat back a few minutes later, Neriana impressed her thoughts on me, showing how relieved she was. She placed the foot down a few times and let me know her pleasure at everything feeling fine. I was relieved. This little incident could have been terrible, but we were both lucky. I rose, thinking it would be best if I led her right away so that she could rest in her stable. I stood, and then my eyes sparked into swirling, flashing stars of dizziness. I collapsed back to the ground, my stomach lurching, clenching, and relaxing again and again. Weakness dragged me down, pressing me against the hard earth. Neriana nuzzled my face, worried. I just needed to rest a bit. The dark, heavy clouds of unconsciousness began to lift, and I became aware of a man's voice. I could not make out his words. All I heard was a stream of unintelligible sounds. With a tremendous effort, I focused on that sound, trying to understand, and it was this effort that brought me back to consciousness. Seconds before I opened my eyes, I understood the voice belonged to Richard. I heard his worry bordering on panic. I'm all right, I whispered as my lids fluttered open in superhuman effort. He sighed, pulling me closer to his chest as he did so. His relief was so powerful I heard it deep within myself. I raised my hand to his cheek only to find it damp. Strength flowed through me at the shock. I had made the prince cry. I'm sorry, Richard, I said, sitting up in his embrace. I never meant to cause you any distress. I wiped away the teardrop which had made its way down his cheek. I felt terrible. What happened? He asked in a hoarse whisper. I hesitated before replying. I couldn't really tell him about needing to teach myself magic after all. Instead I said, I felt suddenly faint. I suppose I must have fallen off Neriana. You aren't hurt? No broken bones? No, I'm quite well. It was just an unlucky fainting fit. Maybe I didn't eat enough, or something. Look, I added brightly, skipping to my feet. I'm in perfect health, absolutely nothing to worry about. I went over to Neriana, who was gazing nearby, and petted her. When I turned back, I saw Richard was still on the ground. My heart constricted with guilt. I hurried back to his side. Are you feeling all right, Richard? He looked different. I couldn't quite place what it was that had changed. The deliberate, ponderous way he came to his feet had me twisting my hands in apprehension. Then came his heavy reply. I'm perfectly fine, thank you. I'm just a little shaken, that's all. I smiled at him. It really was Richard, here in the forest with me. My heart took wing. I hadn't seen him since Mother's funeral, and now I had him all to myself. I frowned. Why are you riding here? I was following you, he said, avoiding my gaze. Ever since your name day, when I went to the house to give you my best wishes for your special day, and they told me you went out every day. I've been following you. It's dangerous to be out alone. You should know that. Oh, but why follow me? I burst in. You could have kept me company instead. My name day. That was 2 weeks ago. I felt bemused by the whole situation. He glanced at me, then looked away. The toe of his boot squirmed. The prince felt awkward. What in Vendale was going on? I must have hit my head harder than I thought. Or perhaps the effects of using up too much magical power in one go were more than just loss of energy and fainting. I had to be imagining things. I never thought of that, keeping you company. I was worried about you and wanted to make sure you were safe, and it seems it was a good idea I did so, he said, still agitated. Oh, Richard, I never meant to insult. I have to admit I'm rather flattered you, of all people, care so much, especially when Father and Edward never showed any interest. They didn't even show any concern about it. I'm sure I would have thought more of it if those around me had shown any interest, but they didn't, so I didn't really think that way. Of course, I'm very lucky to have you as my secret guardian. I felt my spirits rise from his unexpected attention. I walked over to Neriana again to give Richard some space and then asked, "Would you walk home with me?" He nodded and we walked back together. I was bemused by his discomfort. Even the most innocent topic made him squirm. Eventually, though, it became too hard to bear and frustration sparked into annoyance. "Richard, could you pull yourself together? I can't understand you at all. First you were so kind to me and supported me. Then, after the funeral, you refused to let me come near you, as though I had some dreadful disease. Now you follow me because you say you're worried about me, but you won't speak to me. What in Vendale is wrong? I thought we were supposed to be friends." His loss for words dragged on into unbearable silence. I sighed. This was not going the way I would have liked it to. I quickened my pace, ensuring I was ahead of him by several strides for the rest of the walk home. He fell back even further, immersed in his own thoughts and leaving me to mine. Then it came to me. The difference I had sensed as early as Mother's funeral was that Richard didn't smile anymore. He was totally serious all the time. I remembered his boyish smile and the laughter that bubbled out of him when he came to play with Edward at our house many years before. He used to chatter to Mother with an unstoppable torrent of words. What had happened, I wondered. Moments later the house came into view. I was relieved I didn't have to bear with Richard's serious silence anymore. I turned to thank him, but had to wait for him to catch up. "Richard," my words seemed to wake him from a dream. "I would like to thank you for your kindness and your concern for me. I promise you no repeat of today's incident will occur. I'll make sure to think more carefully before I do something rash or anything that could be dangerous." Then I spun around, but as I moved out of the shade at the edge of the trees, he grabbed my hand. "Wait," he said, "don't go just yet." He removed a small silver box from his breast pocket. "It would be silly of me to forget to give you your gift." I was stunned. No one had given me a name day gift this year. Father and Edward had both forgotten. I opened the little box to find a beautiful oval pendant nestled inside. It was engraved with an intricate plant design very similar to the one on the belt Mother had given me. "It's beautiful," I whispered, my eyes shining. Impulsively, I threw my arms around him and whispered, "Thank you. It is a lovely gift." He stiffened in response to my hug, so I dropped my arms from around him and took a step back. I closed the little box and tucked it into one of the little velvet pouches which were worked into the belt I wore. Then I smiled up at him once more before turning and setting off for the house, with Neriana in tow. A short while later, as I was washing, Beth knocked on my door. There was an uncommon urgency in the sound. "My lady," she gasped, "His Highness the Prince is here. He asked to see Master Edward. What should I do?" I was surprised. He knew Edward was out. What was my strange prince playing at? "Show His Highness into the parlour and tell him I shall be down shortly. Ask Bert to prepare tea and cake or something. Make sure there is something. And Beth, send Lily to help me. Please hurry." In a frenzy, I threw open my wardrobe. My eyes wandered over the grey and black clothes I had been wearing since Mother's death, and then they fell on the dark blue dress with its brightly coloured brocade bodice I had loved so much before. That one. Definitely that one. I was still struggling to adjust the bodice over the white blouse when Lily came to help me. She was a true marvel. Within moments she made me look presentable. As I was about to rush out the room, I remembered the locket. I hurried back to the dresser, pulled the little box out of the pouch, and fastened a chain around my neck. I checked in the mirror to make sure it was on straight. Then I glanced at myself, an unusual act for me of late. My large eyes stared back at me above wide round cheeks. My button nose wrinkled. I had never been satisfied with the looks bestowed on me. For a change, though, I felt content with my efforts, and hurried out. Richard stood by the parlour window, looking out over the garden. I admired him as I approached. Again, he had grown, his shoulders had filled out, leaving him looking sturdier and stronger. I curtsied when I was a few steps away from him and said, "Your Highness, what a pleasant surprise. How may I be of service?" It felt strange speaking to him in this way, but I knew Beth and Emily could be nearby, and I didn't want to give away we had met in the forest, in case Richard didn't want to let on about it. He turned, startled by my voice. I came out of the curtsy and looked up at him as he was, half turned towards me. He had the funniest expression on his face. It took all my self-control not to giggle. He opened and shut his mouth several times. For the first time in my short life, I actually felt pretty. It was a strange feeling indeed. "Please take a seat," I gestured at the couch right beside him to break the awkward silence. He sat on the very edge of the seat without saying a word, his back reminding me of a rod. How was I going to keep up appearances with his odd behaviour? I lowered myself onto a soft upholstered chair with the gracious air I had been taught at finishing school. A low table stood set off to one side between us. "Beth mentioned you asked for Edward," I began. "Unfortunately, he doesn't get home until very late in the evenings. It surprises me you came here to see him, as I'm sure you must be aware he is at the palace during the day for his training." "You're right, my lady," he said with a sigh. "I should have recalled. I was passing by and thought I'd call on him." It was odd talking to him like a prince. After all, he had insisted I didn't, but one had to keep up appearances in front of the staff. It would be terrible if rumours started spreading, since I was still considered too young to be in a room alone with a man. However, the circumstances of my life made this particular situation acceptable, as I was the only person of reasonably high social status in the house at that moment. Beth came in with the tea, giving me the opportunity to serve it to fill the suffocating silence. When she left, I sealed us in, muffling our voices so no eavesdropper could actually hear our conversation. All they would be able to make out was that we were talking. Richard said, "Tell me, my lady, how are you? Much time has passed since we last spoke." "I am very well, thank you, Your Highness." "I'm truly glad to hear it. So tell me, how do you spend your days?" I glanced up at him as I passed him his tea. "I've spent my days outdoors making the most of the glorious weather we've been having." "You go alone?" He feigned surprise so well. I realized he was putting on an act for the servants he was certain must be listening at the door. What was he trying to do? Uneasiness seeped into my whole being. Something wasn't right. "Milady, you must be aware of the terrible dangers of riding alone. You could fall and injure yourself, or worse, come upon unsavoury people who could do you harm." My mind clicked. In an instant, his intention dawned on me. He was trying to get the servants to worry about me and not let me leave. Although I knew I had already foiled his plan with my little spell, I could feel the bars of a gilded cage closing in around me at the thought of not being able to go out anymore. Anger seized me. "You are cruel, Richard," I shouted. "How could you? Making the servants keep me here in the house locked up? I suppose you wish for me to wither away in the darkness with no access to the sun's light. How could you conspire to keep me locked up with nothing but memories of Mother, while Edward and you get to be outdoors and go about as you please? Why should you and Ed have all the freedom in the world to do what you wish, but I must be a good girl and stay cooped up at home, never to see anyone, never to do anything, because that is what is expected? Why should it be my duty to protect my so-called honor? What is that anyway, my honor? Whoever came up with that? And why don't boys have honor too? And why should I do anything so pointless anyway? It isn't as though I'll ever actually get married. And now you would take even that away, the little freedom I do have. I thought you cared about me." I'd risen to my feet, fury coursing through me. He stood, anger flashing in his eyes too. "I do care, Elisabeth. That is exactly why I'm doing this. You're not safe out there, alone. These are dangerous times." "So you would lock me away into despair," I cut in furiously. "You would wish for my complete unhappiness. If you really cared, you'd find a way for someone to accompany me so I could go out. Don't you think I've thought about this? I am alone. Who would go with me to call on other ladies? I'm not allowed to do anything on my own because I'm not of age. Do you think Edward would go with me? Or father? I snorted in derision. Going for walks or rides on our land is the only thing I can do, and now you would take that away from me too? Why pretend to be kind then? If you're going to be that cruel, you might as well admit it, lock me in a tower and throw away the key. In our anger, we'd drawn closer and closer together. My vexation vanished and was replaced by a terrible pain in my chest. My breath caught in my throat. He was so close. His eyes captivated me like a deer caught in the hunter's gaze, unable to move. His arm circled my waist and drew me closer. His lips pressed onto mine. At first I was shocked. Then my mind went blank. I don't know if I responded to that kiss or not, but I soared. He might not quite fulfill all my wild imaginings of whom I would want to fall in love with, for clearly he was far too serious and wanted to keep me locked away at home with my dark loneliness. But for all his faults, he cared about me, and in that instant I realized I loved him. When I came to my senses, Richard had drawn away, and he pushed me from him quite forcefully. His gaze did not meet mine, but I sensed he was angry again. For a moment he stood there, his chest heaving, and then he turned and stormed out of the house. I took a deep gasp of air. I had not even noticed I'd been holding my breath. What in the king's name was happening? The door slammed with a heavy thud, and I sank into a seat as though the door shutting had cut through Puppeteer's strings which were holding me upright in the wake of my altercation with Richard. Confusion ran rampant in my mind. What was going on? Richard had behaved so strangely. Then doubts and fears took hold of me. First there was this new feeling I had found the matching concept for. Love. I was in love. It had just happened. Without even noticing, I had fallen in love with Richard. My thoughts jumped to the implications. He was the crown prince. That meant I could become queen. Oh, the gowns I would wear, the things I would do, the power I would have. With a start, I sent my megalomaniac self back into the depths from which she had sprouted. This was all unreasonable. I didn't even know if Richard thought of me in that way. Certainly he had kissed me, but if any of the stories were true, that hardly meant anything. And then, of course, there was that tiny little but quite significant detail. I wasn't even proper aristocracy. It would never be allowed. As soon as the nobility found out I was in love with him, they would have me locked up. Father was a commoner after all, and I had learned from Mother's situation that as soon as you married beneath your station, you were excluded from the right circles. She had pretty much lived as an outcast, this manor becoming her prison as it was now threatening to become mine. At least Mother still had her duties as a member of the royal circle, but I had no such claim. So it was clear. There was no way I stood any chance with Richard, except maybe if he really did care for me that way. Did he? Or was I now just deluding myself to think there was any real hope? He had left in a huff, but he had been genuinely worried about me. Yes, of course, there was also that to think about. What was I going to do about going out on a daily basis and practicing my magic? All I wanted was the freedom to go where I wished. Was it dangerous for me? I supposed it could be, but I had been out every day for weeks without seeing anyone, not up in the meadows and the mountains, nor in the king's forest, which no one was really allowed into. I had a right because part of the forest happened to be on the lands belonging to our manor. I had not met a soul. I had not even come across a forester. Then again, if something were to happen, there wouldn't be anyone around to come to my aid. What should I do? I had not thought this through properly when I just rode off on my own. There could perhaps be very serious dangers, but if that was true, why hadn't anyone said anything? Why was Richard the only one who seemed to care enough to point this out? And did he really care, or was my imagination getting the better of me? I sat there, slumped in the chair as the parlour darkened, losing myself in confusing passageways of thought, and becoming more and more self-critical. Edward found me there, rousing me from my reverie. He walked over so quickly I barely had time to take note of his approach before he was standing beside me. He looked serious when he asked, "What's all this about you riding off every day to heaven only knows where? I thought you spent your days here at the house." Treacherous tears welled up. This was the final straw. He'd set Edward on me. How could he? Without a word, I rushed out and up the stairs to my room. As soon as I slammed the door shut behind me and turned the key, I let the hot surge of exasperated despair pour out. This was just too much. Edward knocked on the door. He was persistent, but I ignored him. I just wanted to be left in peace and quiet, to weep away my anger a little. Finally he left, and I was able to calm down. I was still muttering to myself about how meddlesome Richard was, and wondering what I could do about the situation, when Edward knocked again. "Zibby, come on now. I would like to talk to you a bit. We haven't spoken in a while, and I'm sorry about that. Please, will you let me in?" he coaxed. I sighed. He would pester me all evening if I didn't give in. I might as well just get it over with. I unlocked the door. I must have been quite a sight with my hair all dishevelled, my lovely dress creased and my eyes puffy. He paused in the doorway, taking the whole scene in, and then he crossed the short distance between us and pulled me into a tight hug. "I really didn't mean to upset you so, Zibby. I'm very, very sorry. I'm just trying to find out what the situation is. Rick came to me late this afternoon and mentioned he was worried about you, that you weren't taking your own safety seriously, and the servants have now confirmed you ride out every day and no one knows what you do." "Oh, right, so you had to go get the staff mixed in with this too," I sniffed, as I pulled away from his embrace. "Go right ahead, the whole lot of you. You know everything about my life. Why don't you all just sort it out together and let me know what you decide to do with me?" I stepped over to the high-backed chair which stood beside the window and let myself fall into it. Curling my legs up under my body, I turned my shoulder, curving inwards. He sighed and sat down at my writing desk, shifting the chair to face me. "Zibby, dear, you gave me no choice but to speak with Beth and Danny in the stables. After all, you refused to speak with me." I glowered at him and muttered, "Don't call me that." "Well, sister dear," he retorted with a hint of humour, "if you would like me to take you seriously, you're going to have to speak to me like an Elisabeth instead of the sullen Zibby sitting over there feeling sorry for herself." It struck a chord. He was absolutely right. Here I was, feeling sorry for myself. Mother would have been disappointed. She always encouraged me to stand up for myself, especially when Ed teased me, but I had let all that slip away from me this afternoon. I took a deep breath, sat up and looked him straight in the eye. I would have to do this right. I owed him an explanation and I would tell him everything. Well, nearly everything. I couldn't tell him about needing to practice magic in peace and quiet where I couldn't harm anyone by accident. "Well," I began, "I stuck around here for a while, but it was depressing and I just kept getting in the way. People didn't need me around and I had nothing to do. I can't go and visit anyone. I'm not of age, so I can't call on any of the ladies or invite them here. Not that it would make much difference, I fear. Mamma was so lonely, and she was an aristocrat. I doubt anyone from court would be interested in spending time with me. Father wouldn't let me return to school either, like I wanted. So I found something to do which I enjoy, while keeping out of everyone's way. I admit I didn't really think about it all that carefully. It never crossed my mind that going out like this could be dangerous. I just wanted to get away from all the crowding memories of Mamma. I broke off because the next thought that popped into my head was Edward's taunting me as a child, which would have been a very crude repayment for his recent kindness if I had added that as a reason not to spend time around the manor. "This is quite a predicament you're in, dear," he said as he crossed the room to sit down on the armrest of my chair. "I'll see if I can maybe come up with some solution." He gave me a quick hug and then encouraged me to come downstairs for dinner. The following day, as soon as Edward and Father had left the house to go about their business, I set off to Mother's grave with a bunch of flowers in hand. I hadn't been there for some days and hoped somehow it would be able to lift the agitation I still felt. I walked because I wanted Nariana to rest her leg a little. She had shown no signs of lameness, but I didn't want to overwork her damaged leg and cause any more pain. I spent a long time beside Mother's grave, going over my doubts again, asking for guidance. However, this time I was unable to find any answers. I remained just as confused as before. I supposed I would just have to be considerate of everyone else and not go out beyond the limits of the manor garden. That way Richard and Edward would not have to worry about me. I would also not be in the servants' way. I could be outside and maybe be able to continue practicing magic without drawing too much attention to myself. In the end, everyone's wishes could be fulfilled, so I ought to probably just do as they wanted. Nevertheless, I didn't want to. I really wished to have the freedom I had felt while riding out with Nariana. It also seemed to be easier to figure out things about magic when I was in nature. Somehow it welled up easily there. But if it wasn't possible, I supposed it would be best to keep everyone else happy, even if it meant I would have to put up with some claustrophobic memories. I felt as though the world had let me down. It should be possible for me to also be happy, shouldn't it? Why was it that everyone else mattered and I didn't? It didn't feel fair, but what could I do? I didn't want to be a nuisance. All I wanted was to mind my own business and to achieve what Mother had said she wanted for me. I wanted to become a good mage and to help the kingdom get rid of those witches. I also wanted to foil their plans as revenge for them taking Mother away from me. But was that too selfish a reason? With head bowed, I walked towards the graveyard's exit. I passed someone, but did not look up to see who it was. Affected as I was by my disappointment at not being able to find a suitable solution, I shunned the world that failed me. Myself was a nuisance for everyone, and I would just have to accept that and embrace my fate. Elisabeth. That voice. I spun around. Why so sad? Richard asked, concerned. I avoided his gaze and with a heavy sigh replied, I've come to the conclusion you are right, and I should stop being a burden on those around me. I should stay home from now on. No, Elisabeth, he took my hand and knelt before me, head bowed. I feel I owe you an apology. I said terrible things to you yesterday, and I fear they have distressed you more than I could possibly imagine. Additionally, I dishonored you. Please forgive me. My eyes widened. So that was why he'd rushed out the day before. Of course, how silly of me not to understand. Kissing a girl one wasn't betrothed to brought her dishonor, especially if she was very young. A woman could never be presented to society if she had lost her honor. That was what had bothered him so much to storm out the evening before. I had been so involved with my own petty considerations I'd missed the point entirely. What a strange situation, I mused. He must have taken my silence as a sign of a hardened heart because he entreated, I also thought much of what you said yesterday, and I have identified a solution, I think. I will perform my duties in the mornings, and in the afternoons after lunch I can meet up with you in the cherry orchard, and then I can accompany you on your rides so you may continue going out, but are at least protected. I hope you can accept my offer despite my callous treatment of you. He looked up at me as he came to his feet. You'd be prepared to do that for me? My heart leapt with overwhelming joy. I flung my arms about his neck and buried my face in his shoulder. Thank you, I whispered, my voice hoarse with emotion, relief coursing through me at the thought of being able to escape the dark walls which had threatened to close in around me. Energy surged through me. I had never been so delighted. I turned to him and caught sight of his knees. I giggled. You have grass stains. He raised an eyebrow as he looked down at his knees. Then he looked at me, laughter gleaming in his eyes, and he replied, So do you? I looked down at my forest green skirts. Sure enough, there were 2 telltale brown stains, a third of the way up the fabric. I looked at them in mock horror, and we both laughed. My heart skipped at the sound of his merriment. When we had calmed ourselves and made our way out of the cemetery, something that had been bothering me came to the fore in my mind. How did you know I was here? You seem inclined to following me about, spy prince. He smiled at me and replied, Mere lucky coincidence. Brian and I were riding towards your house when we saw you walking this way. If we'd been but a few minutes later, I would have been waiting for you to leave the house for your ride a little later on. I would have missed you entirely. Brian? He's my manservant and personal guard, and the only person who knows anything about you. He will never break my trust, so rest assured our secret is safe. Again, he was concerned about my social standing, which would be affected should anyone ever find out about our secret meetings. He walked back towards my home, followed by Brian leading Richard's horse. After a short silence, Richard commented, "You've stopped wearing dreary clothes. I'm so happy. Colours make you look beautiful." A hot flush crept up my neck, pleasure knotting up my stomach at the compliment, as my heart skipped on the word beautiful. I'd never thought of myself as even remotely pretty. My looks didn't match the social standards of beauty, and I'd resigned myself to being unsightly. But since the day before, something new had happened. First his look when I walked into the parlour, and now his words. All of a sudden I felt like there might be a chance I could be pretty if I didn't allow the norm to get in the way of who I was. Although all these thoughts flitted through my mind, I merely said, "I felt it was time to look a little cheerier, especially if I was going to stay at home all day. You saved me from that, but I think I shall stick to my colourful clothes from now on."